All right, welcome everybody. I think we'll get started. I'm Linderman, Senior Fellow here at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, and I am delighted to welcome Dr. James Coyle, author of Russia's Border Wars and Frozen Conflicts. We're excited to talk to him today about the book and connect it to current events here in the United States, in Ukraine, and elsewhere, and also see how it might help us better understand the Kremlin's approach to foreign policy, etc. But first, let me talk a little bit about the book. It's meticulously researched and very accessible, and it's for sale after the event for $30 less than the price on Amazon, so get your copy today. The book examines Russian military and political activities in Moldova, Georgia, Ukraine, and Nagorno-Karabakh, and it finds that there are similarities in the 4 case studies, and those are Russian support for minority separatist movements, Russian intervention in these conflicts as Russian control over the diplomatic process to prevent resolution of the conflicts, and a perpetuation of Russian presence in the area. Dr. Coyle, for those of you who don't know, is a senior fellow here at the Council. He's also director of global education at Chapman University and a visiting professor of public policy at Pepperdine. And formerly, he served in a variety of positions in the US government, including director of Middle East Studies at the US Army War College. So, as you know, here at the Council, we've been heavily focused on the situation in Ukraine, all its various aspects, and helping to really facilitate substantive policy discussions. So I'm excited to be able to welcome Dr. Coyle to talk about these issues. His book really has a comprehensive review of the situation in Ukraine and examines it in relation to international law and politics. He also demonstrates how Ukraine is really the latest manifestation in a recurring pattern. So let's get started. I'm going to offer a few questions, and then I'll open it up to the audience for your questions. So Dr. Coyle, you argue persuasively in the book that the Kremlin, when it believes it risks a border country slipping into Western orbit, creates frozen conflicts to weaken, divide, and prevent these countries from moving away. So what can be done to disrupt this dynamic, and what sort of policies should the US and Europe adopt to counter this approach? And if I may, just ask sort of a related question. The West has been using sanctions as a means to punish Russia for what it's doing in Ukraine. Are they effective? Are they being used as a replacement for military deterrence? And if so, should they be? And what other methods, if any, should be used? So thank you.
Wow. Well, thank you, Laura. First of all, I don't have to say anything about my book now because you've already given the entire plot away. But if I could, I'd like to answer the second half of the question first, which is the question of sanctions. Sanctions are useless. Sanctions are symbolic. That's all they are. It's so that a congressman or a senator can go home to their district and say, look, I did something about Ukraine. I did something to stop the Russians. Well, what did they do? I mean, Sergei Lavrov cannot go to Disneyland on vacation. Well, I don't think he was planning on going to Disneyland on vacation. And there are a number of people who have had their bank accounts, they're not allowed to use the Western banking system. Well, Russians don't use the Western banking system. Russians go to Cyprus. I mean, if you really wanted to do something on sanctions, you'd talk about the Cypriot banking system, but not the fact that they can't use the New York clearinghouse. So as far as I'm concerned, I think sanctions are really effectively useless. They did have some impact recently in the Iran case. They did get the Iranians to the table, but I would challenge anybody to say that it's because of sanctions that they actually made a deal. I don't think anyone can make that case. Now, what can we do about Russian incursions on its borderlands? I'll be honest, not much. And the reason is because President Putin has been quite clear that he's willing to use force to protect what he considers to be Russian national interests. For us to retaliate with force or to move him against force, this almost immediately brings us back to the worst of the old Cold War paradigms. And I don't think anybody wants to go there. So that leaves non-military measures. And to me, the non-military measures, what we can do is we have to help the central governments become the governments that the people of those countries want to have. That means economic help. It means building their economies. It means, in some cases, providing financial aid. For instance, it was not that long ago that one of the countries in the Caucasus wanted to leave the Kremlin orbit, wanted to sign an association agreement with the European Union, but they were expecting a large financial aid package from the European Union. When it didn't materialize, they ended up signing with the Eurasian Union, which is not what we want. So sometimes we need financial aid as well. The other thing I think that we need to do is we need to be very firm in all these cases that we don't accept the status quo that's been created. We can't say that we accept that Abkhazia or South Ossetia are independent countries. We can't say that Crimea is a part of Russia. It's not going to pay off tomorrow. It took 75 years before Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania were able to achieve their independence again, but the United States always recognized that Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania are independent countries.
Thank you, and thanks for outlining some of those non-military measures that you recommended. So to dive in a little deeper here and maybe get a little more specific, you explained in the book how the Kremlin used peacekeepers to perpetuate its military presence in Georgia and Moldova. Can you dive into that a little bit more, connect it to current events? How is Russia using or might use this strategy in Ukraine right now? And how should the United States and Europe respond?
They've already proposed it, yes. In Moldova, the Russian army, I think it's the 14th Army, is in Transnistria. They actually fought on behalf of the separatists. And then when Russia decided to stop the conflict, Russia proposed peacekeepers. They set up a peacekeeping commission, and it would be three parts. One would be Moldovan, one would be Russian, and one would be Transnistrian. So since the Transnistrians and the Russians were allies, it meant that the Moldovans are outnumbered 2-1. Similarly, their peacekeeping force in Moldova is outnumbered 2-1. And that doesn't mention the troops of the 14th Army that are still there. In Georgia, after the original fighting in 1992, they imposed peacekeeping troops in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. These were not peacekeeping troops that were sanctioned by the United Nations. The United Nations did acknowledge that they were there and that they were keeping the peace. But they weren't officially blessed, if you will, by the Security Council. They froze the status quo until 2008. In 2008, when President Saakashvili decided to try to reinsert the central government's sovereignty over these provinces, the Russians honestly were waiting for it. I mean, there's this tunnel that connects South Ossetia with Russia, and there was an entire Russian army unit with the tank engines running on the other side of the tunnel, just waiting for the fighting to commence. And when it did, they poured right in. Once the fighting stopped, again, they put in Russian peacekeeping troops. They then recognized Abkhazia and South Ossetia as independent countries and signed treaties with these. So they're no longer peacekeeping troops. Officially, they're there as allied troops of these new countries. That being said, the Russian Foreign Ministry just sent out a statement that the peacekeeping troops in South Ossetia are a model for peacekeeping that has kept the peace for 25 years, and that there are other peacekeeping forces around the world that are now copying the Russian model in South Ossetia. Well, that's fine, but under international law, South Ossetia is part of Georgia, and that means this quote-unquote peacekeeping force is actually an occupation force.
Thank you. Yeah. So I want to sort of maybe bring the discussion a little bit closer to home. In the book, you argue that Realist political theory explains Russian foreign policy in action. So in other words, when faced with a perceived growing threat to its national security, such as building up NATO's military potential and the perceived movement of NATO into Eastern Europe, Russia uses a variety of tactics to weaken neighboring countries and their allies. Does this theory explain Russia's meddling in the US election and current attitude towards Washington? Have current Western institutions enabled or emboldened Putin in your view? Or is Putin's recent aggression better explained by pressure from within his own country, political or otherwise, or some combination of both?
President Putin's actions are not impacted by pressure from within his own country. You know, we have a tendency to look at Russia and to look at them the same way we project looking at how things work in the United States. It doesn't work that way. I know I've heard people on the Hill say, you know, oh, if we put these sanctions in, if we just squeeze the oligarchs enough, they'll put pressure on President Putin. Well, I was very lucky a few years back to go to Moscow as a guest of one of those oligarchs, and he told me an amazing story that they had all been summoned to the Kremlin, and all these people that were millionaires and billionaires were in an absolute sweat in the waiting room because they knew that their entire fortunes were reliant on the president. It's not that the presidency was reliant on these gentlemen's fortunes. So why does Vladimir Putin do this? The answer is very simple. He's trying to protect Russian national interests. It's not, I mean, this is what, those of you that are practitioners, my apologies. I used to be a practitioner, but I'm an academic these days. I mean, realist political theory says that any country out there is a potential enemy, and you have to protect yourself by building up sufficient power in order to do it. But the power equation is relative, right? Usually when people talk about this, they then start talking about how the other country tries to increase their power. Well, what the Russians have perfected is what they're looking at is not how other countries are increasing their power, because they're not. But rather, Russia tries to decrease the other country's power. And in doing so, in a relative concept, their power has increased. There's an added bonus to this. I mean, there's the geopolitical concepts that are involved here, right? Brzezinski used to talk about the grand chessboard. I remember he talked about Ukraine, and he said, Russia with Ukraine is a great power. Russia without Ukraine is a rump Eurasian state. It's not my quote, Brzezinski, anybody? But nonetheless, you know, so there's the geopolitical concepts that are at play here. But there's another one too. We, the West, talked about giving Georgia and giving Ukraine membership in NATO. One of the things that NATO insists upon is that a country have full control over its territory. So as long as these countries do not control Abkhazia, Ossetia, Crimea, Donbass, they can't join NATO. And that's also to the benefit of the Russians.
So to probe that a little bit further, what should the US or the EU and do to try to disrupt this dynamic as it stands right now? What would you recommend policy-wise?
Economic assistance and help in building the economies of the home countries. Simple as that. A lot of these countries have massive unemployment. Georgia, as an example, I think they say officially their unemployment rate is around 10 or 20%. But that's because they count every single individual that lives on a farm as being employed. So if you discounted that, they have an 80% unemployment rate. So, you know, if you can improve that by cut it in half, you've just won the support of half your population because they have jobs. And I think if you look at the people that live in the separatist areas, they're going to look across the border and say, hey, my friends have jobs, I don't. And I think that's its own dynamic.
Yeah, makes sense. So thanks for the explanation of realist political theory, and it's actually really interesting in the book, so I encourage everybody to take a look at that. But it does lead me to ask, so what other findings did you find most surprising or interesting throughout the project, or most important, that you'd really like to highlight?
The biggest finding was the pattern. I was relatively new to this part of the world when I started doing the research, and to see the pattern over and over again, that there is ethnic unrest. All of a sudden there is Russians supporting the separatist movements. Eventually they're getting financial aid, material aid. When fighting breaks out, in many cases the Russians fight on behalf of the separatists. Once this is all in bloom and the Russians now have an excuse to have their forces in the area and their influence has been returned to the area, they call for a peace. And when they call for a peace, they call for a peace conference. And who becomes the chairman or the co-chairman of the peace conference? The Russians. And the first thing the Russians do is they find ways to make sure that the peace conference never actually achieves peace. In Nagorno-Karabakh, as an example, right, the Minsk process is 25 years old. 25 years. The Russians have made sure that there's no peace. In Ukraine, another Minsk process, Vladimir Putin himself gave the people at the process the steps and said, this is what you need to do to achieve the peace. And then what happens? They say, oh, well, yes, we all agree this is what needs to be done, but which is step one and which is step two? Which comes first? What about step number 4? Should we move that up? And so there's always this reason why we can't solve the peace, and in the meantime, people are dying.
Thank you. So to switch gears a little bit, can you talk a little bit about the Russia-Turkish dynamic? Keeping in mind Russian-Turkish relations, what should the approach should the U.S. take towards Turkey? Or what were your findings on this topic in the book as well?
Well, I didn't really address Turkey specifically, although at the end I do make the case that perhaps some of these peace processes should be expanded to include other countries that are regional leaders in order to offset some of the influence of other countries. But the Russian-Turkish dynamic, I would contend, is a continuation of this geopolitical conflict that we're seeing. And let me go back one step, because I'm not sure I made this point. I'm not the one that brings realism and realist political theory into this. President Putin does. President Putin, in his speeches, talks about how, you know, other countries are threatening Russia, that they need to increase their power in order to protect themselves against other countries, that they need to balance and things like that. These are all, I mean, it's like he has it's like he has Kenneth Waltz's book next to him at his nightstand. You know, so it's not me. It comes from the top. Now I lost myself. What was the question?
Oh, Russian-Turkish dynamic.
Russian-Turkish dynamic. So it's a continuation of this attempt to win on the chessboard. Turkey's been a NATO ally for over half a century, and yet Turkey gets all its natural gas, not all, but gets quite a bit of its natural gas from Russia. It's getting a couple of nuclear power plants built by Russia. It is in Syria, it's on the same side of the conflict with Russia. Last year, I forget which one, I think it might have been Sergei Lavrov said that we consider we consider Turkey to be more than a friend, but a strategic ally. Interesting choice of words for a NATO country. What should we do about it? In my opinion, we need to take more attention to Turkish interests. You know, why are we supporting groups in other countries that, when they're in Turkey, the United States has declared them to be on the terrorist list? I think our interests are not the same as Turkey's. You know, we can't do everything that Erdogan wants us to do. But where there is common ground, or where there can be common ground, I think we should look for a solution.
Makes sense. Thank you. And you mentioned Syria, so I wondered if you could talk a little bit about Syria and the takeaways you have for Russian actions in Syria and their effect on major players, US, EU, Turkey.
Well, now why is Russia in Syria? Russia has a major military base in Syria, their naval base, the only naval base on the Mediterranean. So they needed to protect that naval base. Why is it important to us? For two reasons. Number one, they provided the power edge that was needed to allow the Assad forces to win in the civil war. I mean, the fighting's not over yet, but I think it's pretty much over. So that's important. But more importantly, from this geopolitical view that I look at things from, it showed that Russia has power projection. Up until now, everybody has talked about Russia being able to impact things on its border. Syria's not on its border. You know, those cruise missiles that came flying out of the Caspian Sea was a wake-up call. They're not, from a conventional viewpoint, Russia still has some difficulties. I mean, the Admiral Kuznetsov sailed into the Mediterranean and then had to get pulled out by tugboats, I believe. But nonetheless, the fact that they can get their troops in there, get their jets in there, fire cruise missiles in there, it's something that nobody believed they could do. And I think it really has sort of shocked the West.
Thank you. I'd like to open it up now. We sort of covered a lot of ground, so I'm curious if we have any questions from the audience. Alex.
Thank you very much for shedding light on this very crucial topic.
Alex, I'm not a Washingtonian, so you're going to have to tell me who you are. I left this city
I'm
25 years ago, and I haven't looked back.
Sure, I'm an Azeri origin journalist based in Washington, D.C. The notion that you mentioned, about information war and real war. So Ukraine perhaps was the latest example where we, visually noticed that apparently those two wars meet. I don't know if that was the case, when Nagorno-Karabakh, happened, or maybe after that, in Georgia, because that was before the social media. But the reality was that we had troublemaker. Russia was also back then was also a newsmaker, because we had Russian-backed state media back then was operating in the region, and there was only media, only news source. So that leads to the question that should we worry about that new reality in the region where, which Western and independent media, they're being squeezed out, and Russian media is being green-lighted. Perhaps that's a wake-up call, a gut punch. Thank you.
I think it's an important concept that you're bringing up. In Transnistria, they listen to Russian television, Russian radio. In the Donbass, that's the only broadcasting they can get is Russian. And as a result, they only get one side of the story. One of the things I saw, Ukraine is a big part of my book. One of the big things I saw in Ukraine was during the Maidan movement, the people in the Ukraine couldn't understand why people were in the Maidan. It made no sense to them whatsoever, because they didn't hear anything that was coming from the pro-democracy forces. All they were hearing was the Russian reports on the Russian television. I think that's important. I think that there's hope in that so far, at least, the Russians haven't necessarily been as sophisticated as they could be. I read as an example that they really didn't have to work all that hard to disrupt communications in the Crimea, because they were their communications. They built them. They didn't, you don't need to hack in. They had all the mapping right there. But as an example, one of the ones there was the Russians put out pictures of a tank, and the tank had swastikas on it, because one of the storylines that the Russians put out is that the people that are in charge today in Kiev are fascists, right? Well, the only problem was that they found the original, and it was like a Reuters photograph of a tank, and it had no swastikas at all. Or they have one woman, a blonde woman, who has appeared on Russian television on different channels in six different cities. And in one, she's a housewife, and in another, she's the mother of a soldier fighting, and in another, she's an exile that's reporting from inside Russia and things like that. What scares me, and not just me, oh, excuse me, the other day I heard NPR, and NPR was interviewing the head of Occupy Wall Street. And the head of Occupy Wall Street was offered funds in order to create a demonstration somewhere. And the guy turned him down. I said, "Why'd you turn him down?" He said, "Well, I turned him down because, first of all, the phone connection was terrible. It sounded like he was talking from inside a tunnel, so I knew it was really far away." He says, "And secondly, the guy I was talking to had a really terrible American accent." He said, "It was obvious I was talking to a foreigner." He says, "So I turned him down." And then this guy said, "I'll tell you what I worry about. When they learn their lesson, when the next time they place a call to someone like me, they make it from inside the United States and they have somebody that's a good Russian speaker." It's the same thing. You don't need to use the same woman in 6 cities if you have 6 actresses, you know. So as they perfect these things, then we have to worry a little bit more. The Spaniards, yesterday, 2 days ago, the Spaniards said that they had evidence that Russia was being involved in the Catalan separatist movement. And they said, yeah, a lot of it is coming from Russian hackers, but they said we're getting a lot of it via Venezuela. So you see, they've already learned. They've already learned. They're no longer just popping everything out of St. Petersburg, send it to Venezuela and send it back. So that's what we have to worry about.
Thank you. In the back, and if you could say your affiliation as well as your full name.
Absolutely. Andrew Clark with the Hoover Institution. Dr. Coyle, do you have your studies revealed? You've talked about Putin and him wanting to assert Russian national interests. Could you identify, or have your studies identified any goals, ends, you could say maybe, for what Russia hopes to accomplish through engaging all these conflicts? And as I suspect you might say, do those goals or ends threaten the United States' national interests to an extent that might warrant a response beyond economic support?
Drew used to be my student. I used to live in fear of going into the classroom. Anyway, Russian national interests are very easy to find because they're on the internet. Whether you want to read the Russian national security strategy, the Russian military strategy, it's all on the internet, and it's translated. It's in English, President Putin has been quite clear. He believes that Russia is the second superpower, and that it has not received the respect that it deserves from that we have ignored Russian interests for many, many years, and he wants that stopped. And he believes that the way to get the respect of the West, and the United States in particular, is to show that they have the ability to assert themselves and to protect their interest in countries around their area. And they do consider the areas that I cover in my book to be their sphere of influence. As early as 1992, Boris Yeltsin said, you know, hey, these countries of the former Soviet Union, this is Russia's sphere of influence, and other countries need to give us the power or the permission to go ahead and intervene. So do we have to be worried about it? Sure, we have to be worried about it. Do we have national interests involved? We do, in the respect that one of our national interests continues to be promotion of freedom and democracy around the world, because it is a value that the United States is based on. Now, the current administration doesn't push it as much as other administrations, but they haven't rejected it either. You know, is it important enough for the United States to, you know, suddenly put military forces on the Crimean border or something like that? I don't think so. I don't think so. If you remember, it's they're major interests, they're not vital interests. We have to decide whether or not the cost-benefit analysis is sufficient.
All right, right here.
Thank you. I'm Pamela Smith, former U.S. Ambassador to Moldova. Could you speak a little bit about energy flows and how you see energy flows through Turkey and through Ukraine as advancing Russian foreign policy, if in fact you see it that way?
You're referring to Turk Stream?
Yes, well, yes.
Yeah, okay. So
Thank you.
Turkey in many ways is in the catbird seat when it comes to energy flows and flows of refugees. In the past, Turkey has been important to allow energy flows that brings energy independence around the world. You know, energy from Baku comes out at the Ceyhan port, and by the way, 40 to 60% then gets shipped to the state of Israel. And that means that the countries of the Caucasus through which the pipeline goes is not reliant on the Kremlin in the middle of the night. If you remember the situation in 2006 and 2010 when the pipelines were cut in Ukraine, and I remember Italy 23 days had no heat in January. But now what Russia's trying to do is in building this new pipeline, the Turk Stream pipeline, it's designed to bring 15 billion cubic meters, which that combined with Nord Stream will mean that they no longer need to use the pipeline that goes through Ukraine. And they've wanted to get rid of, they've wanted to stop using Ukraine for years. I think they recognize that the transit fees that Ukraine gets is one of the major props to the regime. It's economic warfare. It's war by another means. And I think the new pipeline through Turkey is crucial to their efforts. That pipeline isn't going. There's no new oil or new gas. There's no new gas that's been discovered in Russia that they can use to fill that pipeline. They have to use the same gas that was going to go through the pipeline through the Ukraine.
Thank you. Right here.
Hi, my name is Dimitri. I'm just a private citizen. I have two questions for you. Thank you very much for writing on such an important topic. The first one is, after researching the topic, how do you feel about NATO expansion, the continued existence of NATO, and the future of European security? And the other question is about, so you said that we should, under no conditions, or you didn't say under no conditions, but we shouldn't recognize these, like you gave the example of the Baltic States, that a non-recognition led to their eventual independence. But under what conditions would we recognize, like South Ossetia or Abkhazia, if they were to declare or whatever their independence, or et cetera? What would be necessary for us to recognize them as independent states? Thank you.
Dimitri, wait, you have to hang because as I get older, I have short-term memory. So I'll answer the second question first, and then you'll have to remind me what the first one was. Okay? So when would we recognize Abkhazia and Ossetia? When Tbilisi recognizes it. Okay? Under international law. I mean, in all these countries, what you have is you have a conflict between two principles of international law: self-determination and sovereignty. Now, we're Americans. We love to give countries self-determination. We think it's a great idea. Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, you know. But under international law, and if you even look at the example of our own Civil War back in the 1860s, the Confederacy wanted to leave. Under self-determination, we should have let them. But we insisted on sovereignty, and we fought a civil war to keep them together. And most important point of this was not the fighting, but the Supreme Court case in 1868, Texas versus Allen, when they said the South is not an occupied territory because it was impossible for it to have ever left in the first place. Okay? So if a country like if an area like Abkhazia wants to leave Georgia, certainly they have the right to demand this under self-determination. But under sovereignty, the mother country has to agree to it. So if the mother country agrees to it, if you have the majority within South Ossetia and the majority of the people in Georgia that says, yes, give them independence, they get independence, and I'm sure the United States would recognize it. So, NATO, that was the first one. Okay. So I do think that the NATO is important. I do think that, I mean, the history of NATO, it kept the peace in Europe for all the years past World War II. NATO expansion, I'm not a big fan of. I think we've already gone one step too far. I mean, we had a tendency during the 1990s and the early 2000s, we looked at NATO as, frankly, as a stepping stone to the European Union. We said, look, country X, you want to join the European Union, but you have to meet all the European Union standards. Tell you what, here's NATO, sort of a halfway house. Meet NATO standards, it'll get you most of the way there. Then once you're in NATO, then you can become part of the European Union. What did we forget? We forgot that NATO is a military alliance. What do these countries, these little countries in Eastern Europe, and with all respect, but what do they bring militarily to the equation? I would contend that they probably are more of a problem for NATO because they're a heck of a lot closer to Moscow and become potential targets of attack than they bring to us. So I'm not a big fan of NATO expansion.
Would you like to see NATO continue to exist?
To continue to exist? Yeah, I would. But perhaps in a different format.
All right, in the back, West of America.
I would like to follow up the previous question. My name is David Nikuradze. I represent Georgian television station Rustavitu, and my question is about NATO expansion and Georgia's ambition to join the alliance. You mentioned that the territorial problems would be the huge obstacle for Georgia to join NATO, but many experts here in Washington, D.C. and in Atlantic Council mentioned several times German example. West Germany joined the alliance, and East Germany, German Democratic Republic, was part of Warsaw Pact till 1990. Do you think that this example is not proper in that case? Thanks so much.
So what happened is that because of the Cold War in post-World War II, we did a bit of legerdemain that I'm not sure that we would accept today. We decided that West Germany and East Germany were separate countries, and therefore we could allow West Germany in. And they would remain separate countries until such time as East Germany became free, and then we'd talk about unification. Could they do that today? Yeah, maybe, if the stakes were high enough. But what would we gain by it? I don't know that NATO would gain anything from it. I don't know that NATO would cost-benefit analysis. I think the cost of doing that, especially the cost of weakening the whole question of sovereignty and international law, exceeds the benefit we would get by having Georgian troops in NATO, especially since Georgia already fights on the side of NATO as an ally in Afghanistan and places like that. So.
Thank you. All right, right here.
My name is Learson. I'm a Ukraine analyst for the federal government. So you're a realist, and according to your perspective on realist theory, what do you think Putin's policy will be regarding the Baltic States in, say, the next 10, 15 years or so?
I haven't done the Baltics, sorry.
All right, and right here in red.
Viola Ginger, I'm a freelance writer and editor.
Hi.
You mentioned that Putin was just pursuing Russian national interests. So do you make any distinction between objectively justifiable, legitimate national interests versus not? And like, what threat then if pursuing these interests in Ukraine and Georgia, for example, was in the Russian national interest, what threat were those countries or any of the other countries along the border, have they been posing to Russia? And how do you view that conception of national interest, considering the consequences that have occurred to Russia in the meantime?
Your first question is actually the trickier part of the question. I mean, who defines what's a legitimate or an illegitimate national interest? You know, that's a really hard one, because what you or I might perceive as a legitimate national interest, the Russians may say, no, that's an illegitimate national interest. The example that comes to my mind right away is Kosovo. You know, we recognized Kosovo's independence. The Russia says, no, we don't recognize the independence. You made a mistake. I'm not saying that attacking Georgia and Ukraine is in Russia's national interests. I'm saying that Vladimir Putin believes it's in Russia's national interests. And I think that's an important distinction. Yeah, you know, I mean, I would not say that it is in Russia's interest to frankly tie itself down, and they're losing so much credibility in a way that frankly the United States has lost in other wars. But nonetheless, why would they do that? Well, in the case of Ukraine, it's an 8-hour drive, and you don't have to go over any mountains to get from Kiev to Moscow. And I'm not the first person to say that's an invasion route. And so you don't want to put an invasion route like that in the hands of people that you have identified in your national military strategy as being the main enemy of your country, NATO. Georgia, not quite the same, but Georgia also wanted to be a part of NATO. Georgia still wants to be part of NATO. A majority of the people of Georgia support membership in NATO. Vladimir Putin in 2008 had a meeting with George W. Bush on the sidelines of one of the conferences. I think it was maybe Chicago. In it, he said, George, you guys are talking about giving membership in NATO to Georgia and Ukraine. Don't do it. We consider it to be part of Russia's national interests, and we will oppose you on this. He says, and in the case of Ukraine, it's not really a state, and we will make sure that it ceases to exist. So clearly the Russians think that it's important.
Right here.
Hi, Brenda Schaefer, Georgetown University. 2 questions.
That's why I know you. Hi, Brenda.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
You mentioned the Minsk process, 25 years, both sides waiting for some sort of resolution, and nothing happens, close to 1 million refugees just waiting for the answer to this process.
So now we're in Azerbaijan, Armenia, right?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
But I'm going to have 2 questions, so one general as well. So, but if we look at the reality of any kind of ceasefires in recent years, we see, for instance, after the April 2016 war, the chiefs of staffs of Armenia and Azerbaijan are summoned to Moscow. There's no American participation. There's no outside participation, and the ceasefire is set in Moscow. Should the U.S. continue in the Minsk process, and what would you recommend to the U.S. under this situation that essentially Russia dictates the terms of war and peace and in the conflict? What would you suggest to the United States in terms of promoting peace between Azerbaijan and Armenia, and also at least delaying or ceasing the chance of war to re-erupt between them? And the second question, and this was prompted by your discussion about Syria. You know, in the past, we take a very normative approach to Russia, and not, you know, it doesn't matter that it articulates very clearly its national interests. Those national interests are wrong. They're illegitimate. Would there be value in actually, instead of instead of judging these interests all the time, to say, okay, these are their interests, they're articulated. And in certain places where we can bend and defer to Russian security interests, for instance, Syria, where they completely got Syria right, trying to incite a civil war, increase a civil war against Assad would only lead to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people and millions of refugees, as we've seen today. We could have bowed to their interests there. Do you think there would ever be any sort of payback in other areas which are more important to the United States?
Wow. When you look at Central Asia and you look at the Caucasus, you find that you are between some incredibly, incredibly important parts of the world. Russia has as many nukes as we have. China, gross domestic product now exceeds the American gross domestic product. Not per capita, of course, but overall. Places where we're in conflict, Iran, and all the rest. To abdicate our role there to the Russians, in my opinion, is to abdicate any opportunity we have of maintaining world leadership. I know to most Americans, you say, well, Kazakhstan is important, and they say, what? But it is. To have an American role between Russia and China, or between Russia and Iran. To say, well, isn't it a good idea to just step aside now and accept the fact that the Russians made this peace thing? The Russians have been trying, from the beginning, have been trying to keep the United States out of the peace process. I would say we should not do that. We should not escape our responsibilities by stepping away from the peace process. That's the first one. Now, the second one was more, everybody has two-part questions. The second one was, can we accommodate the Russians sometimes? Well, that's what diplomacy is all about. Diplomacy is to find places where there are common interests, or places where you can work together, and work together there, because it's in both sides' interests. So absolutely, I think we should be looking for places where we can cooperate with Russia. Yeah, I mean, some of the greatest Cold Warriors that we had during the Cold War, Richard Nixon, right? I mean, he brought us détente. He found a way to work with these people. Ronald Reagan, I mean, it was the evil empire, and yet by the end of the evil empire, it was him and Gorby out, in a love fest. I mean, and the end result of that was the collapse of the Soviet Union. So, yeah, I think we should find ways to cooperate together.
Thank you. Right here.
Hi, Kevin Reel from the Department of Defense. You mentioned the example of the Baltic states during the Cold War, and our non-recognition of the Baltic states was a policy that we should now replicate with the various enclaves that Russia is supporting in its periphery. Our non-recognition of Soviet annexation of the Baltics had little impact on Soviet behavior. They colonized and continued to hold on to that annexation, and our non-recognition was not the reason that they became independent. They became independent because the Soviet Union dissolved just outright. Correct. What impact do you think our non-recognition will have on Russian behavior? Will it be a benefit, or will it be a similar neutral effect as seemed to occur during the Cold War?
I think it'll have a neutral effect. It's a holding action. It's a holding action. During all those years that we recognized the Baltics, did we expect the Soviet Union to collapse? No, unless we were George Kennan. George Kennan predicted it, but he was off by a factor of 10. But right now Russia is projecting power. Russia is projecting power. Russia's got a declining economy. It's It's an economy that lives on resource extraction, extraction of raw materials, and then the purchase of finished materials. You know, there's a term for that I learned when I was in college. I think it was mercantilism, colonialism. I mean, but basically, it's not the way into the future. And not only that, they're at peak production. They're in order to continue to sell their oil and gas, they're now trying to drill up in the Arctic Circle, Sakhalin, where for 9 months out of the year, you can't even get the oil because the pipelines are frozen. They're at peak production, and the estimates are that by about 2023, their production is going to start going down. On top of that, their population's in trouble. They have a negative birth rate. So right now, in my opinion, Russia's in a use it or lose it situation. Russia's got power today, power that it can project. 10 years from now, it won't have that much power. At that time, maybe we can have a discussion about Abkhazia and Ossetia. Maybe they won't be as interested in opposing world public opinion to support a couple 100,000 people. Or maybe not.
Right here.
I'm a pedestrian. In the First World War, German army was 20 kilometers from Russian capital, Petrograd, in a Don River, inside Russia.
Right.
In the Second World War, German army was in Volga River. Even Germany fought against 54 countries together. Why until now United States extremely against real German army? Bundeswehr is not army, it's police forces. And also the United States extremely against concept of European army. Frankreich, Deutschland, and Poland can create army who not even can stop Russians. They can kick out Russians outside Ural. No more NATO, no more money from American taxpayers.
Well, NATO's now in the process of creating a rapid reaction force, and it's in Europe, and it would be independent of the United States. And the United States supports the idea. So I think as this new administration talks more and more about how countries need to be providing more for their own security, I don't see that we would be necessarily opposed to more of an inter-European armed force.
Thank you. All right, right here in the front.
It's not a question, it's a little comment, because I want to disagree with you on this statement with how you mentioned costs and benefits and what smaller Eastern countries paid. They pay their lives actually in paying, because that's the price. If you don't want to see your war in front of your nose, so please keep the smaller countries to be the buffer zone. That's what Ukraine and Georgia are trying to do and doing, and Transnistria, but like in 1990s. So this the first point. The second, not 8 hours to Moscow. It's only 10 hours to Luhansk border. It's to the end of the eastern part of Ukraine. So it takes more time to get to the Russian border. And the last one, I just wanted to remind the Budapest Memorandum in 1996, which everybody tries to say it was not promisable paper. Unfortunately, now in 20 years and 4 years after the war, I think it's not the position of the U.S. as a part of this memorandum. Thank you.
I think the Budapest Memorandum, I'm awfully glad you brought it up. I think it's actually more important from an international law viewpoint than most people recognize. The Budapest Memorandum is memoranda, there was more than one document. What it basically said was, Ukraine, you agree to give up your nuclear weapons. You're going to send them all to Moscow, and Moscow's going to destroy them. In return, Moscow and the United States agrees to protect the borders of the Ukraine. We'll do nothing won't allow invasion across Ukraine, won't do anything economically against Ukraine, and frankly, we recognize Ukraine within its international borders. And the United States signed as a guarantor of this, and Russia signed as a guarantor of this. Now, those that want to bash the United States say, United States, you didn't do anything. You were a guarantor. Russia violated this. You didn't do anything. And of course, the United States, in my opinion, a weak argument, says, oh, well, even though we agreed to be a guarantor, there's nothing in here that says what we have to do as a guarantor. Well, okay, but it does say you're the guarantor. So, you know, guarantee it. But the second one, I think, is much more important. You know, Russia is a guarantor. Russia agreed that Abkhazia and South Ossetia was part of Ukraine. I'm sorry. Russia agreed that Crimea and the Donbass is part of Ukraine. There's nothing in the Budapest Memorandum that talk about a Novorossiya. There's nothing in the Budapest Memorandum that says, oh, you know, Khrushchev made a mistake back in 1954. No, it says, this is the borders of the Ukraine, and we agree to respect those borders. And they didn't do it. And they didn't do it. So they're in violation of international law.
So that I want to take the moderator's prerogative a little bit.
Hi.
Can you just push the topic of the gray zone a little bit further and talk about how you see that in the book and how that relates to you know what we've been talking about is happening in these 4 countries, sort of from a connect the dots for us from that perspective.
So we're back to where we were at the beginning. What we have is 4 countries surrounding Russia. These 4 countries all want to be, well, let me rephrase that. These are 4 countries whose governing elites wants them to be independent countries. There are groups that have not benefited by the rule of these governing elites. Those groups, looking for ways to get some of the benefits of an independent country themselves, said, we as an ethnic group, we're being abused by the majority population. We therefore want to have our independence. Or at least their elites wanted to have independence from the home country elites. Once that occurs, Russia moves in. And once Russia moves in, Russia stays. That's what I found.
Thank you. So with an eye on the time, I'm going to ask for 2 more questions from the audience, and then we'll wrap up. Ambassador Hall.
Thank you. Alex Hall, formerly British Ambassador to Georgia, and now with the Atlantic Council. I just wanted to pick up this issue again about the costs and benefits of NATO enlargement, because, of course, I agree that NATO members need to take those into account, but aren't we in a game of chicken? And it's a game of chicken that Russia is constantly winning, and we are biting. So they occupy territory, and then we say, oh, well, it's occupied territory, and therefore no country can join NATO. And we allow them to get away with all those tactics. And until we draw a line in the sand and refuse to accept those tactics, Russia will continue to use those tactics. And arguably, the Baltics are now safer because they are in NATO. And it's precisely this fact that countries that you've been talking about are left in this limbo that is precisely what's creating the insecurity. And in terms of costs and benefits for NATO members, to say, well, countries as small as Georgia don't bring much to the alliance, I think misses that NATO is a values-based alliance. And it's about upholding the choice of free and independent countries to make their own free and independent choices and to choose to be democratic. I also take issue with the idea that the NATO is the back path route to EU membership, because I think it's actually the other way around, that countries in this region have been pursuing closer association with the EU as a way path to NATO, because it is NATO membership that will guarantee their security in their eyes and prevent Russia from invading them again. That's what they hope. But it's a game of chicken, because if we miscalculate, we end up in a very violent and dangerous situation. But arguably, it was waffling in 2008 that led to the 2008 war with Georgia, and it was that waffling that prompted Russia to feel it could get away with it in Ukraine. So I just want to push a little bit back on the costs and benefits, and whether we couldn't be more robust. Thank you.
Well, we're not going to be in agreement on everything. But I do agree with you that it is a game of chicken. And I also agree that outside of the NATO alliance, we have allowed the Russians to get away with it because we're a little concerned about the possibility of ending up in a nuclear conflagration. I also think we did draw a line, and that line is the NATO borders. Now, we patrol the line symbolically. I mean, NATO's got, what, 4,500 troops? They've got 2,000 troops in the Baltics and 2,500 Americans in Poland. Well, if the Russian army decided to invade, I don't think 4,500 troops would do very much to stop them. So but I think the symbolic importance of saying, hey, we are here and we've drawn that line in the sand that you're discussing, I do think that's important. I don't think that our waffling in 2008 caused the invasion. I think Saakashvili's misunderstanding of our promises led to the 2008 invasion. We said, yes, someday you're going to be a member of NATO. He thought that meant that if he took on the Russians in South Ossetia, that NATO would back him up. Well, he was not a part of the alliance, and Article 5 did not pertain. So.
Thanks. All right, right here in the front. Last question. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Ksenia. I'm from Ukraine, a political scientist. So thank you for your deep work on the topic. So as maybe it's one of the final questions, I would like to ask it in a broader context about the implications of all these trends for the international law, because we see that in every situation, the reason why the conflict is actually frozen and there is no movement is because of the current state of the international law when the part of the conflict is impacting the decision making. I'm talking, for instance, like the most prominent example is the veto right in the UN. And we know that the reform of the UN is being discussed for years and years and nothing is going on. But also, for instance, the rules about the international missions, because we have now in Ukraine the OSCE monitoring mission, but of course there are no limitations of nationalities who can be the members of the monitoring mission. And sometimes it creates a discourse of how trustworthy are the documents or observations expressed by the mission. So, and Ukraine is just one case. I'm sure in three other conflicts the situation is the same. So do you see like any trends and concrete implications for the international law that can be done to resolve the current problem and maybe to prevent similar situations in the future? Thanks.
Within international law, no, I don't see any changes because, frankly, what's happened in all these conflicts is that international law is not really being observed the way it should be. For instance, the monitoring mission is supposed to be able to go everywhere and see everything, and yet, you know, when they go into Donetsk or Luhansk, they get fired upon, and so they can't see what's going on there. Same thing happens in Georgia. There's a monitoring mission, but it's only allowed on the Georgian side of the border. The Russians won't let them on the other side of the border. And it goes on and on. So it's not the question of international law, it's the application of international law.
By the way, in Crimea they're not allowed. The OSCE
right.
mission is not allowed.
Because they say, well, Crimea is not a conflict zone, it's part of Russia.
But that's the question, like the consequences for not sticking to the international law.
Correct.
It should be punishable somehow.
But who enforces international law?
That's the question.
Yeah.
All right, well, I think we'll wrap it up. Thank you very much for your time, Dr. Coyle, and these were very comprehensive and thought-provoking remarks. So I'd like to remind everyone, if you'd like the book, it'll be available after the event, and thank you very much.
Thank you.